Okay, welcome everybody. This is the fall 2023 budget workshop, and we've timed it in the fall, knowing that you're all moving into budget presentation season. So here's what we're going to do today. It's going to be a brief review of basic budget practices. Most of this, many of you already know, but just a quick review of that. But it's really going to be in the context of the fall presentation that many libraries need to do for their select board. So just some brief overview of like some terminology and what a budget does and doesn't do. Just to explain that there's different types of budgets. This is going to be today about operating budgets. So again, that budget that you develop between the board and the director and then present to the select board for approval, hopefully approval. So it's not going to be about capital campaigns. It's not going to be about fundraising. We do have some recordings on Niche Academy that deal with those. We have a great one from Christine Graham about fundraising. We have one about general grant writing and some other things related to the grants that are coming up from the Department of Libraries. So I just want to be clear that that's not what we're talking about today, but there is information on that on our website and on Niche Academy. Also, one about historic buildings, which will be of interest to many of you when these grants do come out from the Department of Libraries. So that's what it's not going to be. It's going to be about the operating budget, developing it, supporting it. How do you deal with it if there might be level funding or cuts? And then advocating for it, because that's a very important thing to do year round, but especially this time of year. And then we'd love to hear some ideas that you have, budget hacks, your ideas about things that have worked well for you, and of course, Q&A. And again, about the Q&A, you can use the chat anytime to ask a question. You can also raise your hand, use the raise hand feature. So we'll be keeping an eye on that. So you're about to do your new budget, a few things that you can do to get ready. First of all, be sure you know whether your library is municipal or incorporated. If you've already done several budgets, you already know that, but it does make a difference. In terms of incorporated libraries, you're probably still getting some money from your town or city. But it's really important that you know that as you're developing it. And also, if you're incorporated, you have certain grant opportunities that municipal libraries don't always have. So just it's surprising how many libraries staff and sometimes trustees aren't actually sure about that. So just be sure you know about that. Also, your fiscal year dates, which can be different in different libraries. It doesn't necessarily match always with the town or the state or the federal government. So that can be confusing, but it's a really important thing to know ahead of time. And then I have on the slide, get even more familiar with your library's mission, values, and strategic plan, because it's really important that your budget reflects that, and not only reflects it, but that it's really motivated by that. So that especially if you have to make difficult decisions about your budget, if you're being cut or just, there's never enough money, right? Even in the most robust library budget. So how are you going to make those decisions? It should be really based on your mission, values, your strategic plan, the current climate of your city and town and organization, and also what you want to do in the future. So I think we can't stress enough how closely those things are tied to the budget. So sorry, there's a lot of writing on this slide, but this is just some of the vocabulary that it's helpful to be familiar with. If you're working with a budget, some is going to affect you as the library director. You're going to deal with these things more closely. Some are probably more in the realm of the board. And I think we have a mix of library staff and trustees here. So I won't go through every single one because you probably know a lot of them, but also I just like to have something in writing. So, if you take this home with you and, look at the slides later or forget, you can always look back on this. So just in terms of being the director, there's the areas that you need to be really in touch with, how much money do you have to spend? How are you who's paying the bills? But it's really important on both sides, trustees and directors, to know who's doing the other things too. So trustees, be aware of which parts of the budget the director is dealing with on a really daily basis, probably for some of the things like collection. They're constantly looking at how much they have left, what are the needs of the collection, how much can they buy, when can they buy it, and also the process of who do they send the bills to. And on the other hand, directors, even if you aren't immediately involved with something like the endowment, be aware of if your library has one or not and who's handling that, because it's just good to have that sort of bigger picture awareness of those things. I guess right now I would stop and ask a question if there's anybody who's not familiar with any of these terms and would like a deeper dive into any of them. Okay, so seems like we're fine there. Again, you can type in the chat if anything comes up. Just a few more things here. Profit and loss, balance sheet, and the budget versus actuals. I want to just emphasize as the director that it's really important that you stay in really close touch with this. Hopefully you have somebody who's, your the finance person or somebody on the board who's managing the budget that will give you this information. If you don't get regular updates on this, ask that person for that information because it's going to be really helpful for you. I know for a while I tried to track this. I mean, I did track it on my own, even but I wasn't that good at it. I mean, so I had a pretty good, it was probably, 90% accurate. And as soon as I got like, started getting the professional reports from a bookkeeper, like this is how much you have left. It just made everything so much easier. And it took one, my sort of clumsy attempt at being an accountant out of, one of the many responsibilities I had. So there's somebody hopefully that's managing your budget who's really skilled in this area. Get in touch with them if they're not already giving you regular information on that. That will really be a game changer for you. Okay, so who's on your budget team? So it seems maybe like it would be obvious, but it's a little bit broader, I think, than sometimes people think. So your budget team is going to be, of course, the board of trustees and, of course, the director, because the trustees ultimately create and approve and present the budget. The select board approves it, but they don't have all the information that the director has. So it's really important that there's a really good working relationship between the trustees and in the trustees and the director in developing the budget and making changes from what it might have worked in previous years. The director is going to have a pulse on a lot of those things in a way that the trustees don't, because they're not, daily in the daily operations of the library. So be sure to also think about your community members are sort of the silent part of the team, because you really want your budget to reflect what your community needs. So they aren't going to be directly in those meetings where you're developing it, but you might do a community needs assessment. You might also just, if you don't do something as formal as that, just be very aware of what's going on in the community. Like, I live in Montpelier. Something that just happened here was the library and a bunch of other things downtown were flooded. Like, that's going to inform what happens with budgets, that kind of thing. Obviously, the pandemic was one of those things. So that's part of your, the larger picture. They're not literally on your team in the planning meetings, but they are in sort of the bigger picture. And again, just the partnership between the trustees and the director. Each of those groups have their own set of skills, their own set of knowledge, and it works best if they really are working together. And again, back to the long range plan, the mission, the values, what things have changed. If is there a population that you would like to reach out to that is in your strategic plan and you haven't done yet? Is that going to influence how you budget and what kind of things you prepare for financially, so you can meet those goals that your organization has? So then the steps in the process, identifying the needs, as I talked about before, doing a community needs assessment. If you have the capacity to do that, you don't have to necessarily do that every year, but just be aware of what's going on in your town. Be aware of other long range things that might be coming up. Are you going to do a capital campaign? Is there going to be a renovation to your building? Do you hope to add more staff? So think about those needs, and again, the long-term needs. And then, of course, identify revenues and expenses. You'll have something probably from the previous years to base that on, but be prepared to, like, if there's anything new, are there any grants that you have? Do you have out-of-town cards? Are there more people coming into town doing that, purchasing those? Any other places that you have revenue coming in? And then the expenses, again, compare to previous years and identify which things might be different. And I'd love to have people put in the chat if they have either revenue that I haven't mentioned already, the town appropriation, donations, grants, book sales, out-of-town cards, fines, what if there are other areas of revenue that you might have in your libraries. It'd be fun to know about. And then when you get to the expenses, you're going to have to think about discretionary expenses, things that you can make decisions about, non-discretionary expenses, so the things that you don't have any control over. And are there any of those different? Are there significant, has fuel gone up significantly? You can't help that if that is the case. So, that's one of those things that you're just going to have to pay for. Also, are there any new plans that you have, or are there any big things where you might have had revenue before? Like in the last several years, a lot of libraries have discontinued fines. So, which is a great trend, but it also means that revenue is lost. So how are you going to plan for that? And how is that income going to be replaced, or is it going to be shifted somewhere else so you don't have to have that anymore? Yeah, I think Margaret mentioned in Friends. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. That's that can be a significant a form of revenue used in a very specific way, but that's a good reminder of that. Thank you, Margaret. Okay, so then you draft the budget, or the trustees draft the budget, you tweak, you look at it, you present to the select board. You may have to do some more tweaking after that. Hopefully at some point you get to the point where it's accepted, and then that last step is implementing and managing the budget, which will go on all year. I believe the next slide. Yes. This is
Joy,
yeah.
Can I interrupt for just a minute? Margaret also had a question about how to report grant revenue in the budget. We can wait until that couple slides from now. I think you have a listing of how the budget looks, and I have some input, but hold that question, Margaret, because I think 1 or 2 slides from now will be a good point to talk about it.
All right. Yeah, thank you. So this is one example of a budget calendar. And you'll see that there are not actual names of the months. It's because fiscal years change, are different depending on the organization. This is from one of Gary DeZiel's presentations that he did. He did some great budget presentations for us over the years. But what I think is interesting about this is that it lasts all year long. I mean, there's something going on with the budget all year, especially the managing and the relationship managing. So you're not just managing the budget, but you're also managing those relationships with people who have to support your budget, the select board, the community, your patrons. So that goes on all year. And then the need identification, I think, is interesting too, because it lasts a really long time as well. But you'll see that you have to pretty much know that by the time you start drafting. So you have to have a good sense of that. And then, the flow of tasks changes as it gets closer to the presentation time. And again, it's not going to be the same for each library, but that's sort of a template in a way. That is and it's a good way, I think, of looking at how just expansive the process of budgeting is. So, okay, this is kind of small. I don't even know if that's big enough for you to look at. And again, you can look at this on the slides later. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with looking at something similar to this. This is borrowed from the Maine State Library. One thing that surprised me on this is obviously several years old, but the categories are probably consistently the same, but it kind of made me feel better that the Maine State Library's example wasn't like a huge budget either. That could be a Vermont library. So, Kevin, you want to talk about the grant question now? Because I don't think that's actually right on this.
Yeah, I think that this is the right slide to look at it from. The practice that I've seen is to just basically add a line that's separate from the line item budget that was previously created, whether it's if it's a single year grant or something that was unexpected or unanticipated during the budget planning process, then I would say adding a line below both the income and the expenditures to track that would make the most sense. If it's a money that you can anticipate and expect to come in, then I would say you could you could add it into your line item budget format above. But if it's something that really came in midstream, I would say just adding a line both to the income and to the expenditures on a spreadsheet like this would be the way I would manage that in the budget.
Yeah, and I think you made it kind of referred to this, that like there's grants you're going to get, like if you're on the courier or the summer performing grant from the Department of Libraries, that comes in every single year. So that could be treated, I think, differently than if if you've planned to apply for like an NLM grant or something like that. Because there's grants that you're going to get, and there's anticipated grant money as well. So you need to make sure that um, you're not depending on a grant that you may or may not get, and also that you are um, being sure that you're not paying for something with a grant that is a one-time grant. Not incorporating into something that you're going to need to pay for year after year. Right. We can talk about grants more now. And Margaret, you can unmute and talk if you would like, or use the chat, either one.
So regarding the question of yeah, waiting until the end of the grant period and grants to carry over, I would say if it's a grant that ended during that fiscal year, then to report it during that fiscal year. Um, I would say if it carries over, or if it's a multi-year grant, then I would say break it out into what you spent during that fiscal year. I think you have to pick something, and I don't think there's a particular um, right or wrong way of doing it. But I think something that makes the most sense to people reading the budget who don't spend every month looking at the budget is what you want to go with, because you want it to be something that uh, your select board or a new trustee or someone from the community who's reading your budget, it would make sense to them. So I would say if it's a multi-year grant, then try to report the amount that was spent during that fiscal year, or that you anticipate being spent during that fiscal year would make the most sense. And you could also, if need be, put an asterisk and explain it. You don't want it to seem like you have more money coming in than you do. That could be dangerous as well.
Well, and you can also, you see how in this example, when there's 3 years on there, so you could identify it that way too. Like if it's a multi-year grant and you're getting a certain amount, the full amount over 3 years, but divided under 3 years, you could reflect that in the different years. And so, yeah, to Dina's question, if we get a grant we weren't expecting, yes, add a line to the income and one to expenses.
Yeah,
Yes. So,
and then Margaret, to your point, I would say report it the same year, because otherwise it's going to look weird. Even though it's not technically correct, I would wait to report it as income until you're actually spending it that during the same year. That way you can kind of show that you've zeroed it out. Now, if it's a multi-year grant, you might report like a third of it. But I think that would be the way to tell the story of how the money was spent in the most clear manner, even though it's technically not correct. But that would be, I think, again, with an asterisk.
yeah, I mean, I think we'll talk about this some more later, but the fiscal years and when your money comes in is not always, they don't always line up. So I think that it's really important that you're not showing that you have more money than you do, because that's going to tempt the city to say you don't need as much money as we've been giving you, because look at this grant you have, or look at this revenue you have coming in. And then also, just to be very clear with transparent about your budget, because it will be it is public. You know, if you're a municipal library, this will be in the town record. So there's one more question. Oh yeah, the how to report funds and use from friends. So I've seen this done a couple different ways. There can be a line or a couple of lines on the budget for the friends, so that because it's really important to separate that out. So again, that the city doesn't look at it and think, you know, you have this income coming from the friends, which could be for a very specific thing, as a grant would be for a very specific thing. So you want to get it not confused in there with things like your regular operations. Um, so yeah, I guess that's what I've usually have seen is like within this, there's also a couple lines for the friends. Is that what you have seen, Kevin?
Yeah, I think that that's fine to report it as both anticipated income if you have an idea of it, and also as a separate expenditure, even if it's going to overlap. So say the friends, give you money for a one-time purchase of ebooks, I would still call it out separately. The other part of this, and this may be even more important than how to account for it, because the accounting really is just so you can tell that story in the most clear and auditable way possible. So you want to tell that story. But I think when it comes to friends' money, it's equally important to have a memorandum of understanding, if possible, between the friends and the library board, so it's clear what the friends are funding. And this goes back into what Joy was mentioning. It's best to have your friends fund things that are not, if possible, that are not typical operating expenses. So whether you separate that up into programming expenses, unusual like furniture purchases, something that's not bread and butter operating, because then you can also say to the people who are funding you, our friends fund X, Y, and Z. They don't fund our daily operations, and that can be very important when it comes to lean budget years. So accounting, do it in the way that makes it most easy for someone reading the document to understand. There aren't any legal requirements that you do it one way or another. But really, I think the most important thing with a friends group funding you is to have that MOU in place specifying what the friends are funding and what they are not funding. So,
Yeah, and to that point, the friends, the amount of money they have is usually based on donations, which can fluctuate greatly year to year. Probably, hopefully more, it fluctuates more than your appropriation for the town, because that hopefully is fairly consistent and maybe even goes up sometimes. But you never know for sure if the friends are going to have a good year or a bad year. You can predict based on, the general economy, and you can predict based on what they've gotten in previous years. But yeah, it's important to have that for discretionary areas, not ones that are not discretionary, which we'll get to a little bit. Actually, in the next slide is about if in the cases of level funding or budget cuts, and what can you do about this? Because it's a harsh reality, fairly often. And I think that you can sort of look at the local climate, the statewide climate, the national climate, and sometimes predict when this might happen. If we're in as a country in difficult financial times, or if, as I mentioned already, the floods that happened in July, that's going to affect municipal budgets, and the library is just one part of that. So, you could kind of think ahead and look at that and try to be prepared preemptively for it. So at that point, and level funding basically means you still have to do some tweaking and moving around. You're not going to have as flush and budget as you might want if it's level funded. It's because of inflation, so it's basically will end up being most of the time basically a cut to some degree. So the choices that the board needs to make, again with the input of the director, which are figuring out which are the things that you can't control, the non-discretionary things, utilities, like building repairs that that you can't function if the organization can't function if there's a leak in the roof, for example. And then there's the discretionary things, which are a lot. I mean, they're like you can to some degree basic library operations, there's some discretionary room in there. Like you have to have a collection budget, but it can change, or you have to have a programming budget, but that can change. Some subscriptions, I would recommend looking at subscriptions that you have. Are they being used? Are periodicals being used, for example, if you're still getting periodicals at your library? Can you collaborate? Can you like join up with other libraries? I think that some really creative collaborations have come out of libraries that don't have very big budgets, so they figure out cool ways to share with each other. This might be a time to like think about that again. Even with your collection, you could collaborate on your collection. Certainly with programming, we see that a lot. And then you know get your budget, but keep in mind that within the budget, you can move things around from line to line if you have to. If you've miscalculated or if something changes during the year, you can make those changes. You can't change the full amount, but you get this as close as you can, and then do what you need to throughout the year. As long as you're transparent about it and can explain it, it's okay to do that. We talked about grants. If you're going to be level funded, are there specific projects that you really want to do that are that there are funders for that might not give you, operating expenses, but let you take some of that money maybe out of programming if you can get a grant for a specific type of programming or technology. The network of the National Library of Medicine has some great grants that I know a lot of Vermont libraries have gotten. Those kind of things, if you can identify those and begin to, tweak your own grant writing skills, or find somebody else, a board member or a volunteer in the community that is a great grant writer. This is an opportunity to dip into that talent base. And again, the mission, thinking about like if you have to cut something, what is it going to be? Is it going to be something that, is sort of an extra that you might really like, but isn't necessarily mission driven. So get back to those things that are really things that are essential to the library's mission. And again, be prepared to explain any of this, be transparent about it to the community, to the select board. And you might actually even get some donations because of that. If you're very vocal about what's going on, people will sometimes realize, well, I don't want that program cut. I could now's the time for me to make this donation to the library. So I just want to say some words about wages, because wages are obviously the staff needs to get paid. It could be considered a discretionary area how much they need to get paid. But even when times are rough, the staff is so important to all the incredible things that the libraries do. So this is also a chance to really advocate for yourself about wages. There's a couple of tools on the slide there that can compare wages throughout the state. I encourage you to compare your wages, not just to other libraries of similar sizes, but to people in other professions. And you'll, once you start doing that, libraries are pretty low compared to other professions. So this could actually be an unusual or sort of paradoxical time to make a case for like, we got to keep the library going. We need to have our really talented staff here who's done great things. So this is a good time to communicate about those great things, both with numbers and with stories, and show the worth really of the people who are doing that work. So that's just like my pitch, to have that part of your budget not be cut, even if you have level funding, because you're the most important asset, you as the staff, that the library has. So they need you there. They need you there in rough times, maybe even more during times when things are going better. So that's just that's going to be my closing point, I think. And I'm going to turn it over to Kevin to talk about related advocating for the budget. Unless there are any questions at this point.
I'm just jumping ahead to the right slide here with
Okay, and then
apologies.
Maria, it looked like you had your hand up. Do you want to say something before we move on to the next section? Okay, maybe not, but go ahead and write in the chat too if you would like, Marie.
Thank you so much, Joy. I appreciate it. I'm going to say one more thing about the wages. This was in my hacks section, but I thought I'd bring it out now. Um, Joy briefly mentioned the idea that a flat budget is actually a cut because of inflation. And I just want to echo that and say, to me, it makes more sense to propose a budget that includes a cost of living increase as the base. And then when you may get called out on that, to feel shocked, totally shocked, that that wasn't something that was already on the minds of whoever's making the decision. There's a very, I wouldn't call it sneaky, but it's true, especially during times of inflation. And boy, the last 4 years we've seen that. A flat budget is in fact a budget cut. So if you in some way can include a cost of living increase as part of your budget, um, in terms of the baseline, and then go from there. That's really the reality of when there are times of inflation. And a lot of the folks making decisions probably weren't around the last time we had, levels of inflation that went up to 7 or 8%. We don't have that now, thankfully, but a couple of years ago we did, and you had to go all the way back to the 80s to find the same level of inflation. So. There's a couple of questions in the chat. Let's see. When the select board requests level funding year over year, found money to fund right. How do you fund salary increases? So essentially, you do have to find other discretionary funds. I don't know about your library, but my library's salaries and benefits were the largest portion of the budget to begin with. So the options are difficult under those circumstances. If you do have some other funds that you can temporarily not use for collections is typically the second biggest item. That's an option. Um, Another option that I've seen used, it would depend on your library, but you can also say we can't pay our staff less. That's not acceptable. So we're going to need to reduce, for example, reduce our hours by 2 hours a week in order to continue to pay the staff the wages that they were receiving. That can sometimes make it clear that the services that you're offering through your library are dependent on the funding that comes through this decision-making process. So making that connection. And then Marie, you had the question, elaborate on a basic needs budget. Joy, can I toss that over to you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I put a link to it in the chat just because it's so you can see it right away if you want to. But basically, it's a publication that comes out and it calls out the Vermont livable wage rate depending on the size of your household. The 2022 one, for example, is $15.33 per hour. I think we know that there are librarians in Vermont that are not making that much. And you can, it's one of those documents, there's a lot of information in it, but you can sort of look through it for the things that are most relevant to what the needs of your library and the needs of your staff. So I mean, there's too much to go into it, right? In depth right now, and it might not even be useful for you to do that anyway. But just looking um, at the basic needs and having that as a reference point, I guess, an advocacy tool, because it is, it's a state document that, it's hard to argue with you know, with the people who wrote it, because, I mean, an authoritative resource, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Thank you, Joy. And Bree, you're absolutely right. Reducing hours is a way of reducing staff pay. There's no way around it. It's just showing the work in terms of what it means if you're not able to receive the amount of money you need to pay your staff. So it is essentially the same thing. It's just acknowledging the result of what's going to happen. So yes, that 100% is true. I'm going to go over, and feel free to drop questions in the chat or hold your hand up. We'll stop. I'm going to go over a few principles. And I think a lot of what Joy relayed, I'm going to hopefully not copy too much, but emphasize some of what she had been talking about. I think the number one thing in terms of advocating for your budget successfully, and if you don't take anything else away from my short segment of this presentation, it's this. Budgeting is not about money. It's not principally about money. It's not principally about your collection or your buildings or the supplies you need to buy or the rate of inflation. To advocate successfully for your budget, it's all about people. It's about relationships. So you need to, as Joy mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, have a really persuasive strategic plan in place about how the library serves the people in your community. That's the basis from which you will be able to successfully advocate for your budget. How the library treats the people it employs. So to go back to Bree's point, it's not, a budget isn't just about the library serving the community. It's also about how the library takes care of the employees, so how it treats those folks. And we like to use the phrase, the library is the heart of the community. That's a popular way to describe a library. And community is made up of people, right? It's not made up of books. It's not made up of dollars. It's made up of people. So advocacy starts with building as many relationships in the community as you and your trustees can. That's really the key. And I think that's also the key for strategic planning, which is what is fundamental to creating a successful advocacy campaign. So I believe that budgeting should not be a surprise for anybody involved, whether it's a lean year or a positive year. I've worked in libraries for 25 years, and I've never had a year when someone came to me and said, "This is a great year for the budget. How much more do you want to ask for, Kevin?" That has never happened. Whether whether it was actually a good year economically or a lousy year economically, never had that happen before. Maybe someday, but there shouldn't be any surprises when you are going to make an ask. Either if you're just asking for a little bit more than the cost of living, or if you're going to make a big ask, um, the groundwork should already be laid out. And the way that you do that is that you have a strategic plan that you have worked with the stakeholders in your community to develop. So, those decision makers aren't just your town manager or your town administrator or the head of the select board. They're also the community members that show up at those meetings. So you want to make sure to have them clued into what the library is doing, or some of those, library champions, like the head of your friends group, if you have one. You should involve them both in developing your strategic plan and also advocating for that plan, because any new ask with a major impact really needs to come out of your strategic plan. Um, I'll give you an example of that. At the last library where I worked, we really wanted someone to do programs because we had all this wonderful new space and nobody to organize it. And so we spent 3 years advocating for a new position just to help out with programs. And that involved putting it into the strategic plan, putting in where the resource gap was, in other words, how much money it was going to cost that we didn't have now, and then talking with new trustees, all of the new select board members. So when a new select board member came on board, we would ask for a meeting with them to present our strategic plan. And then all of those ways that you involve the community in terms of focus groups and surveys and other elements that build into your strategic plan to make sure that what you're doing is actually something your community wants, which we did see in our planning. So kind of having that conversation over not just one, but maybe a couple of years before you actually present that as a new ask. So nobody, people have heard it enough that it's not a surprise that they want a new position, or it's not a surprise that they want more hours for that position. It's something they know that you've thought about, that you have a reason for doing, that the community supports, and that they've heard before. So always, as the slide says, tie what you're doing to your strategic plan. I want to talk about the big meetings that are part of the budget process that would drive me crazy because so many decisions were made like that at some of the big planning meetings. I'm going to try to jump way back to this slide that Joy so thoughtfully laid out the budget calendar for. So these big meetings, if your fiscal year, if you start in January, typically start to happen around now, maybe September, October, and that's the drafting the budget and developing and presenting the budget. So I'm talking about those meetings where you go before the decision makers. And if you're a municipal library, that's probably your select board. If you're an incorporated library, that's probably one or more select boards who are helping to fund your library. So how to be successful at those big meetings. They're not easy, but what I would say is make sure to take the limited time that you're going to have and craft a story around why you're asking for what you're asking for. So you will likely have 5 minutes, 10 minutes at one or more budget meetings. And either you or your select board chair will be presenting and then sometimes on the spot negotiating with the decision makers for what kind of funding you're going to get. So you're going to want to know your budget through and through, and also probably more importantly, if you have not been through that process before, go back and look at, if you can look at, if there's any recordings, or look at the meeting minutes of how those meetings have gone before, or talk with someone so you can get a sense of what the decision-making process is for that board. The more you know about what goes on at that meeting and how those decisions are made, whether they will cut items on the spot, ask you to make reductions and bring them back, occasionally ask you if there's something you need that you didn't ask for. That I got that question once and I was not prepared for it because it was so out in left field compared to what I was used to. But become familiar with those folks and try to also, if possible, get on a first name basis with the decision makers. So if you or your board chair have not had the opportunity to sit down with select board members, try to make that opportunity, and your town manager, because if you already know them, it's much more, it's easier to have that conversation. One more
So
thing
Kevin,
else.
there's a
Go ahead.
question in the chat about if they're not allowed to present the budget, any suggestions for submitting a budget that has to stand on its own? So is there, I mean, you've probably already done this, but have you advocated to just try to be able to present it? Because I mean, I think that's, I mean, you don't have to go into like a lot of specific details here in this meeting, but I just think, I mean, I wonder why that happened, how it came about, and if there's any way you can change that, which I'm sure you've already tried. But so I think if you can present something that's very clear visually, like the way Kevin was talking about before about showing sort of the story with the numbers, and then I wonder if there's a way you can just also have a written narrative, like a paragraph or something, like highlighting some of the things that you would say in your 5 minutes if you did have the 5 minutes, and the successes of the library and the needs of the library. I mean, would they? You're not allowed an infographic. Wow. Hmm.
Yeah, that sounds, so this may not answer your question the way that you want it answered, because it sounds like the relationships there have somehow come asunder between the the library board and the select board. So you can speak during public comment, but I would ask, are other departments allowed to present their budget? Is it just your department that is not allowed to have that presentation? Oh, not just the library, all town departments. Okay, well that's good. So that means you're not being singled out at least. Um, So I would say one option there would be to include something that really does provide more information by way of a link. I know that that technically may not follow within the rules, but if you could provide a way for people, even if it's just on your website, to refer to it, then you could provide some of that supplementary information, and people could follow it if they wanted. I think that's a reasonable thing to do. Another technique, and I'll talk about this on the next slide, but another technique that I would suggest is trying to um, trying to find a champion on the select board who is a library supporter who can tell your story at that meeting. So you're not allowed to go and advocate for your budget at the meeting, nor are the other town departments. But what you can do, if it's possible, is have the head of your trustees talk with whoever you think the most amenable select board member is and say, I really want someone on the select board to know why we're asking for what we're asking. Would you be willing to sit down with me and go through it and provide that information? And furthermore, I don't think that that's a bad practice under those circumstances for every department to do. So you wouldn't even have to limit it to the library. You could say, this is a new way we're doing budgeting, but it would be great if the select board members would liaison with the departments, including the library, so that at least one member of the select board knows the backstory behind the numbers. That, I think, would be my approach, because it's above board. It accomplishes what you're trying to accomplish, and at least one member of that decision-making group has that background. So I think that's the approach I would take, Margaret.
So there's
Um,
also a question from Bree about the select board is more has an easier time with things like concrete things like gravel, sand, even books, um, but a harder time with people and stories. Any tips on making stories a bit more concrete? Outcomes, like if you're able to say like your story time, um, instead of going on sort of the warm fuzzy of a story time, what if you related it to early literacy or kindergarten readiness, those kind of things that are numbers? I don't think, would they consider numbers concrete enough? Because I'm sure you have them. Other thoughts on that?
You know, I think it's an interesting question. And again, it comes back to what the library is these days. So more and more libraries are not what perhaps um, our our parents' generation thought they were. I was at the physical therapist's office the other day, and he asked me what I did for a living, and I said a librarian, and he said, "Oh, a member of a dying breed." And since I was receiving medical care from him, I didn't, you know, come back with what I might have come back with. But I think that question to me comes down to trying to re-educate people on a library that serves more and more as a place for the community to come after school, a place to come and do programs, to meet, to be that community center, as much as it is a place with traditional resources. And again, some of those, that shift from physical books to ebooks and e-resources as well as a part of that. So, we are coming up with a 30-second elevator speech that, tries to encapsulate that idea that we're moving away from physical resources more to resources people can access from anywhere. And we're really becoming more this community center function, as much as we are a repository of books. I think telling that story is where I would start there.
Yeah, I guess again, I mean, it's, you say have given them all kinds of numbers, but maybe the numbers in the unexpected places, like, how many people used your library as a cooling center or a heating center, or, those kind of things that have to do with the mission of the community, maybe of being a certain kind of space that's, that, what is it? where the library's outcomes coincide with the town's mission, where they might not expect, in unexpected ways.
Yeah, that's a good point. So looking at what's going on in the town and how the library is supporting that. Our department looks at what the governor's priorities are, and we try to push all our work into what those 5 priorities are, even though sometimes it's a big stretch, but we make that effort. I would also say I've heard the term data-driven before, and someone told me that a better term for that is data-informed, because data isn't something that people make decisions on or makes them feel warm and fuzzy inside. You can use data to inform the decisions, but really those stories, if you're able to relay some stories that back up whatever those hard numbers are, that's really the way to persuade people. So, all right, I'm going to talk a little bit about some budget hacks, and then I would love to spend a few minutes getting some other ideas that people may have for the budgeting process, some hacks that they have. Let's see. Actually, I'm going to start with Vicky because you have a hack here. Vicky writes, successfully received capital expenditures in the town's capital budget. So they wouldn't be able to fund them themselves. And that's actually thank you for sharing that. That goes right into one of the hacks that I'd recommend. If you do see a capital project on the horizon, or you just know your building is going to need a lot of repairs in the future, if you don't have a reserve fund that every year you're putting some money away into, that's a great way to build up to those larger expenses that you may not be able to bond for in your town. One example, South Burlington, when they were looking to build their new library, they established a reserve fund 3 years before the budget was put in place for the library and town hall. And by that time, people were so used to paying into the reserve fund that they were able to say there was no tax increase for the new building because it was part of the money that was going into that reserve fund. So reserve funds, if your select board is amenable to that, are a great way to put money away for larger expenses. I think they're underutilized. It's also a fiscally responsible way because you're showing the work in terms of spending that money every year versus a bond. Another suggestion that I have, if you do have access to friends funds or trustee managed funds, and you want to do something but you can't get the funding from the select board, is to use those funds for a proof of concept. I have used trustee funds as a library director to do things like hire a contract cleaner to come in twice a week and clean the library for 6 months. Or I've used them to expand hours for, I did a 3-hour a week Sunday pilot in Middlebury using trustee managed funds as a way to prove, yes, we are going to see twice as many people come in the library per hour on Sunday as we would on Thursday evening. And so this is a good use of your ongoing money if we ask for these funds to cover staff. So using a small amount of money you've reserved as a proof of concept can be a way to advocate and show that something was actually worthwhile for doing. And I would love to hear, and feel free to raise your hand or type in the chat, any other hacks that you have. Or if there were questions that we missed in the chat, please bump them back up and let us know again.
There are a few. One is Abby had a question about the amount. Sorry, I'm trying to find it. Sorry, where is this question? Or Abby,
oh yeah, there it is. How much of your income should come from the town versus fundraising versus grants? Oh, I wish there was like a clear number. I honestly, I would say as much as possible from the town is considered best practice, and I'll try to explain why. And I'm going to go quite a ways back. When Carnegie donated so much money to establish so many hundreds of libraries in the United States, one of the stipulations he had in place was that the municipality would match the funds in a lot of cases, and also that they would fund the library for at least, I believe it was 10 years into the future. Correct me if I have the history wrong, but there was a stipulation that not only would your community get a library, but your community would get a library that was funded by the municipality and not by a private organization. And so that was 100 years ago. But the philosophy, I think, still holds true that a municipally funded library is one funded in the most democratic way by the people and has the least chance of having having fundraising that runs dry, having an endowment that gets spent down to the point where you no longer are able to successfully keep the doors open. I have seen that in a number of libraries. So best practice is to have the highest percentage of funding from municipalities as possible, because that's the most stable source of revenue. Joy, did you want to jump in?
Well, I just wanted to say that there's almost as many versions of that as there are libraries. So there, as Kevin led with, there isn't like one formula for that. But the more you can get from the town, absolutely, because it's probably more consistent as well. And you can look at the public library survey, the annual report, that and get some idea of that just to have comparisons. And then sometimes that can help inform your decisions. But it's going to look a little bit differently, in different towns, in different organizations. And there's also a question somewhat related to that about the difference between municipal and incorporated and how that affects your library. So municipal library, Gene, is one that's voted, historically was voted to be a town or city library. And they typically get most of their funding from the town, from taxpayer money. Incorporated libraries are independent nonprofits. They always, I think it's fair to say that they always do get some funding from their municipality as well, but it's not usually as much. So the balance between municipal funding and grant funding and other fundraising is different in incorporated libraries.
Thank you, Joy. That was very helpful. I want to answer Dina's question. Is there a way to determine how much a town can spend? I don't think there's a way absolutely to say this town, but definitely you can use the statistics from the Department of Libraries to benchmark. I think the most useful statistic there is your population size and then your per capita expenditures. So there's a per capita tax expenditure that is tied to every library that's reported their statistics to the Department of Libraries. In Vermont, the average per capita so that's how much every man, woman, and child in the town, how much is being spent on the library is $48. Now that varies wildly. And the sources of revenue also vary wildly. But if you look at the statistical report and then look at how big in terms of a town your library is, that'll give you a sense. There you go. So, and Dina, $9 is not, it's low, but it's not something I haven't heard before. To build on that, there are some towns that draw revenue, some libraries that draw revenue from multiple towns. For example, typically incorporated, like the Bixby Library in Vergennes, or the Kellogg Hubbard in Montpelier, and they have different per capitas for different towns. So yeah, Catherine Hayes has to go to 5 different select board meetings and argue for different per capitas, which makes very little sense, but it's just the reality of it. I want to mention one more thing before I go, and that's a book that I read recently that mentioned library budgets. It's called Bibliotech, TECH on the end. And the essential argument that the author makes in the book is that libraries really should be funded at about twice as much as they're being funded at now, because we have all this extra work we need to do in terms of digital archiving that we're not even doing. So traditionally, a library was the community archive. And these days, nobody is the community archive for all of these various meetings and events, and the history of the community is essentially are at this point where we don't know if we're going to have any history really recorded because nobody is doing that right now. And so it's a book. When I read it, it was really eye-opening. It made me think about the fact that I've never been asked for why I need an increase in a budget when I was a library director. So so I'm just going to leave you with that. We do that book. It's called Bibliotech, and we do own it. Thank you for that link at the Department of Libraries if you want to ILL it. But I'd highly recommend taking a look at it if you want to get the fire in you for not just getting the same budget, but getting some more money. It makes a great argument for that. And I'll turn it over to Joy, but thank you all so much.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. And thank you all for your really good questions. They're difficult questions and really important questions. I did put a link to the evaluation for this and a link to that book that Kevin mentioned. And I think, I just want to end with this is a big topic and we're always here to answer questions, and we will look up questions for you if we don't have them right away. So please do fill out the evaluation, and good luck with your budgets this year. And thank you as always for coming to our workshop.